Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum. The ISF podcast is hosted by ISF CEO Steve Durbin, and every episode he brings listeners features timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. Today, Steve speaks with Ganesh Krishnan. Ganesh is a cybersecurity expert with over 25 years of experience protecting the digital world from cyber threats at companies such as Yahoo and LinkedIn, among others. These days, Ganesh is CEO for a startup he co-founded called Anzena, which aims to empower employees with simple and effective security tools. Steve and Ganesh cover a lot of ground today, from using AI to cloud security to moving your organization's workforce, from security training to engagement.
So, Ganesh, thanks very much for making the time to join me on the podcast today. Lovely to have you.
Well, thank you. Great to be here.
You started out in looking at cyber and sort of all things computer science related back in Purdue, in graduate, I think, in 1997. So, in the world of cyber, that's a huge amount of time that you've been involved in this space. And, following on from that, you worked at Yahoo, you worked at LinkedIn. So you've really had a good coverage of what's been going on across cybersecurity over that period of time. What have you learned about cybersecurity? For anybody listening to this, what is it?
Yeah,
what are the key things you've learned?
It's finally important. For the longest time, very few people knew what it meant and why it was important. And it was like just pulling teeth, convincing people to invest in cyber and kind of take care of things the right way. I think, in 20 years, 25 years, that tide is changing and people realize that it's important. They need to invest and they need to protect data and information. I think that's one of the biggest shifts that I've seen in cyber.
I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to chief information security officers, board directors. Some of them would probably take issue with that. Some of them would say, well, it's still not that easy. I mean, trying to get this message across, it isn't as well understood as it might be. What are some tips that you've got for those that are listening to this who are thinking, I really do wish I could if there are just one or two things I could do or say to crystallize the importance of cyber for a board member or some of my teams, what would those things be?
Well, I think cyber affects every single thing a company does. Every single thing, right? It's not just related to product development or this or operations or sales. It basically affects every single thing that a company does, which means it affects the reputation and the trust of the company as it relates to its customers, its users. And, gone are the days where people would tell me, hey, prove that I can get hacked. Right? You see this every day in the news over and over again, to the extent that, if you say you haven't been hacked, you just don't know it. Right? So I think the reputational damage, the financial damage, the trust damage with customers is immense. And so it's really important for people to take it seriously. If people don't take it seriously, it's a matter of time before it really affects your business. Companies have gone down because they haven't taken cybersecurity seriously.
Again, though, let me just challenge that, because some might turn around and say, well, that's fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and some companies have made a good living off the back of that. But we're in the midst of an economic downturn. Money is tight. Mm-hmm. How is it that we can have developed to the point that you say, and yet we're still seeing security teams suffering from being under-resourced, under-financed, and CISOs are still having the problem of trying to get access to that money to protect the company in the way that you've been describing?
Yeah, so it's not just about money and resources, right? So what we've been talking about so far is the importance and how to kind of explain the situation to people. The point of resources, it's never about getting more and more resources. It's never, because anything that you do, even if it's your core business, at some point you'll run into a situation and you keep asking for more money and resources, people will ask why. And that's perfectly fine. CISO should ask themselves, why am I asking for this resource, right? And obviously this depends on every company's situation is different, but you have to, as a CISO, figure out, okay, here are my top priorities. Here is the resources that I need. Do I have the resources and or the money to make those happen, those critical needs? And in a downturn, if you always have priorities, you can start to take things off the bottom. And that's true of any business. And we should think about security as part of the business, which is what I said. And so not everything can and should get funded, even in cybersecurity, but it is really important.
Right. So we're seeing some new evolving trends, I guess, in security, not least of which is, of course, artificial intelligence. Now, you started an AI-based company some years ago, and in fact, you sold it fairly quickly to Sophos. How do you see artificial intelligence in particular changing the world of security? Is it going to help? Is it going to hinder? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think artificial intelligence is pretty much part of most companies these days, right? Like once you get to a certain stage, the prerequisite to artificial intelligence is to actually have enough data so that you can derive intelligence insights about what your customers are doing in whatever context your company is operating. And security is no different. Like security, AI has always been important and critical in security because it's a wide area, like I said, right? You can think of security as, fraud detection in a bank, right? It's
Right.
all artificial intelligence based. Like, okay, how do I profile who my customers are, how they're using the system, how they're using the card, or online, offline, all of that stuff. And then predicting, okay, this current usage that I'm seeing, whether that's fraudulent or not, right? And so it has always been prevalent and super useful. With generative AI and large language models, it's even going to be even more prevalent, right? Because it's changing the entire world as we know it. And security is going to be no different for the good people and for the bad people, right? So you can use generative AI for good. So, for example, to better understand certain threats, train your employees. There's lots of chat GPT questions you can ask it about security. The attackers can do the same. The attackers can then use that to generate phishing messages that look extremely real, right? No more typos, right? Don't
Right.
train your employees to not look for typos anymore because it's not going to be there, hopefully, for anybody half as smart, right? So it's going to change the spectrum for attackers as well as for the good guys and gals. So that's how I look. It's an integral part of every business. It's not a separate thing anymore, artificial intelligence, including security.
You made that point about, of course, any organization that makes a broad-based use of data is using AI or will have to use AI. But do you think, the skill sets in place at the moment to really understand how AI can be constructively, usefully used? I'm thinking particularly of the challenges that we're seeing in terms of regulation, governance around artificial intelligence and how it might be used across organizations. So, do we as individuals have the set of capabilities yet? Do we fully understand what AI can do, I guess, is what I'm asking.
No, I mean, I think there is just the possibilities are endless, right? And so at any point in time, there can be more done. In terms of regulation, it generally tends to lag behind
Yeah.
any groundbreaking technology. So it'll take a while for regulations to catch up. And so, no, I don't think we know the possibilities. I don't think we fully understand how AI can be abused, and also don't fully use AI to the capabilities that we could in fields like cybersecurity, where it could be incredibly useful for protecting companies and data.
Now, AI is clearly top of mind as far as very many media outlets are concerned. And as with most emerging technologies, you tend to levitate, I suppose, more towards the bad press than you do perhaps the good, because that doesn't make much of a story, does it? So, today we see Spotify and Apple Music taking down a particular track that an AI created using the voices of Drake and the Weeknd. And so everybody's now going to be concerned about this, deep fake that's out there and what that might mean. For me, I see that as pretty instructive because it does actually sort of demonstrate to people the power of the tool that we absolutely have in place and how we can perhaps best use it. Now, I mentioned before that you'd started a company that focused on AI. One of the things, as I understand it, that you were focused on there was trying to protect the cloud environment.
Yeah, AI was part of our company, to be clear. It wasn't
Right.
just an AI company. The focus was to protect the cloud, and we used AI where necessary to do it.
So tell us a bit about that, because one of the things that people talk to me a lot about is this concern they have about cloud. how do you protect my data that's in the cloud? So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately you have to put your data somewhere, right? So
Right.
10 years ago, before AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, 10, 15 years ago, before they existed, people used to put data in a data center that they used to rent space all over the world and manage it themselves. But, those cloud companies, and obviously applications have moved this way as well to become software as a service instead of installed on your machine or servers, that people adopted it because it was just much, much easier to get up and running as a business or find a productivity tool that you wanted to use. So I think from that perspective, it's a great thing for businesses. And anytime you have a new thing, you obviously have to figure out what are the risks and how to protect it. Now, it turns out the risks, if you look at cloud risks, they're not that different. Like people are still the risks are still malware, phishing, supply chain, right? How do I secure what has changed is how people deploy their systems,
Right.
and the fact that the way they deploy them requires them to rethink how they secure and protect those systems. That is what has changed with the cloud. And there is no question that people have to hold themselves accountable for protecting data in cloud, not AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, because they're giving you a service to run the business. And the only thing you can outsource in life is responsibility. So I get this question a lot, like, if I move my data to AWS, Azure, or Google, am I not responsible for securing it? The answer is absolutely not.
Right. Now, you made an interesting point slightly earlier when you talked about people, because for me, security always comes back to people. I mean, all the things we've just been talking about, they're just tools. People are at the heart of security, as far as I'm concerned, whether or not you're on the user side of things or whether or not you're trying to protect on behalf of the users. But the point you made was that, and I'll paraphrase, it was something along the lines of, don't have your people looking out for missed commas and things in phishing messages anymore because the AI has taken over and it's doing that. So clearly that's shining a bit of a light on the need for human-centered security. And that, I think, really has to go in hand with the way in which you, I, others, people come to security. So we need to be looking at the element of human psychology in all of that if we're going to ever stand a chance of cracking this security nut. So I want to hear your thoughts on what we can do to fix some of that disconnect.
Yeah, let me start with like what we do today. So the security generally has three pillars, right? People, process, and technology. And you can fit what you do into that. And then you obviously talk about the people part. And so when it comes to people part, in security, we have people exercise once a year when we know that they encounter daily threats and they need to exercise pretty much daily to stay fit. So if you have people exercise once a year, you can expect them to stay fit in cybersecurity. So you got to exercise more often in a way that's meaningful, that's contextual, that's engaging to, for example, employees at an enterprise or a company, right? So we have to move away from this notion of training to engagement.
Right.
And what that means is people really learn. So there is this famous Chinese proverb that goes like this: tell me, I'll forget; show me, I'll remember; involve me, and I will understand. Right. And so we have to get to the third point. We are at the first point right now. Tell me it's important. Tell me people forget. Right. You have to involve them and help them understand. And what that means is building messaging systems, processes in place that understand what employees are doing at their job, and then engaging them in the right way to get them to understand their own security posture and their own security issues, and getting them to exercise often in a meaningful way. To give you an example, we might train employees on safe sharing of information once a year. In 2 weeks, about 2 weeks, that information is completely lost because it's like a 1 hour video and safe sharing was, 1/10 of whatever else we told them in that video. But employees share data all the time, right? So can we find moments when employees are actually using their tools to reinforce that learning with, for example, micro lessons, but at the same time also get them to undo actions or mistakes that they've made? So imagine something watching what you're sharing when you're sharing files and then saying, hey, Steve, you shared a file with sensitive information. here is a better way to do it. But by the way, you can also, here is a one click way to undo your mistake, right? And so that what's important there is that whole context, of course, the training snippet that we may choose to send, but getting Steve to actually realize that that was a mistake and actually undoing the share, right? And you can find many, 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 many moments like this. It's not just one, that's just one example. We can find
Right.
hundreds. And so, how can we then? This is what gets someone like Steve to exercise on a daily basis. And so, we need to move away from this notion of training, yearly training, or punitive stuff to employee engagement and contextual information that gets people to retain stuff.
So, how do we go about doing that? Because again, there'll be people listening to this saying, well, I get it, I understand that, but that sounds incredibly complicated. I've now got to perhaps revisit the whole way in which I go about engaging with my employees, managing my data. And some might say, well, yes, that's exactly what you've got to do. But how can we go about doing that? Is it about culture? Is it about process? What are the steps?
Yeah, I mean, a culture is a consequence of doing something like this, right? So culture comes from, when you involve someone and help them understand that over time, as they participate, will change culture. So culture is a consequence of doing more sophisticated things. I mean, today, if you look at it, today, what people are doing, or what all most of us are doing in cybersecurity training, is just checking the box. And we pretty universally, people know that that's not leading to effective cybersecurity education or training. The only reason people do annual trainings is to satisfy a compliance box, right? So people know that it's not effective. Yes, it is complicated to do this more effectively. So, there have to be new products, new systems, new processes built in order to make this happen. And that's where the whole human element and human platform solutions and industry needs to head. We don't have really great solutions to do this today.
So, if the solutions aren't in place to do it today, how should a security leader respond when, say, an employee does make a mistake that compromises security? Walk us through, the best strategic response to what is going to be inevitable human error.
Yeah, I think we should basically stop talking about employees as the weakest link,
Right.
right? Because if employees were the weakest link, our businesses would be dead. Because if you cannot trust your employee, you cannot run the business, right? So we should first stop saying that. People, including CISOs, myself included, I've made mistakes, lots of mistakes, security mistakes. What needs to happen is an empathetic, positive engagement with an employee. And then it may be a teaching moment to just physically go to that employee, have that conversation, and say, here is a better way to do it. And help us make this better, right? Like volunteer them to help spread the word, right? So when people make mistakes, they're in a best position to learn from it and spread the word.
Right.
Use them to spread the word across the company. If you don't have a system, you can do it as recruiting. People making mistakes are not all bad. People are good intentioned in most cases, right? So you can use them as your champions, right? And a lot of CISOs are already looking at security champion programs, not just and that those programs tend to focus more on product development and engineering, but there is a role for security champions across the entire enterprise companies as well. So start there. And then, as more tools become available, like for example, my company and Zena, that this is the problem we are focused on. I mean, then you can look at tools like that. And I'm sure more tools will come up, not just us.
One of the challenges still that a lot of CISOs talk to me about is this whole hybrid working. Because during the pandemic, they had no option but to have remote monitoring and look at the business from that standpoint. Now we're seeing a lot of businesses who want to come back into a physical environment, and some that are still deciding to live in that hybrid or indeed remote world. And I think the challenge that a lot of people talk to me about is how do we right size, if you like, our security posture? Now, you talked about security champions, and I fully endorse that. I think that's a great way to go. But again, the challenge that a lot of people talk about is how do I have a security champion when perhaps my workforce is distributed all around the world? They're all remote. They don't come into a physical location. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, remote work is a reality, whether we like it or not. I mean, people have gotten a taste of it, and there will be some combination of hybrid work, right?
Right.
And so the same way we all, one day lights shut down, and due to COVID, all of us had to work from home, and people figured out how to do their jobs remotely, and so being a security champion is part of the job. So I don't see that as directly being tied to coming in physically to an office, because you can have, if people are doing their jobs remotely, security champions is all about, like, volunteering people and getting them to do stuff, spreading the word, and that's already happening at various levels at most companies. So I don't see remote work as an impediment to that.
So your message then, I suppose, is don't be put off by the fact that you may not have all of your workforce in one place. The sorts of things that we've been talking about are perfectly manageable, perfectly achievable, whether you're in a hybrid environment, an office-based environment, or
Yeah, you
indeed
don't
remote.
ever count on all your people being in one place. That's like so 10, 15 years ago.
Right.
That's because even before the pandemic, as there's a huge talent shortage in cybersecurity,
Yeah.
right? Long ago, people had started hiring remote workers in cybersecurity because you just couldn't find people where they were.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's been a reality for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Ganesh, we started talking, looking backwards. Let me now ask you to look forwards. Where do you see cybersecurity developing, going in the future? What's the future direction for us?
I think that's certainly an open-ended, broad question. I mean, I think AI is definitely going to have a huge impact on cybersecurity, just as suddenly things are changing with generative AI. I think that the threats are going to get more and more sophisticated as basic doors get closed. So, when I started in this field, you could find out stuff open on the internet, and you could, own machines remotely very easily. Or, you could change a web page and form, and, you could pretend to change the price of something that was $10 to 10 cents, right?
Right.
So, all of those easy attack vectors will become harder, but we know that attackers get more and more sophisticated as the easy doors get shut. So that should not make us complacent. In fact, that should make us more worried, because the more sophisticated the attack is, it gets harder to detect those sophisticated attacks as well. So the threats will kind of remain the same, because people have to work, so there can be malware on their machine. Humans are can click on bad things and can infect stuff. Phishing is going to continue to be a problem. People writing software applications is going to be a problem. Cloud, of course, is a problem. People are a problem, like we discussed. What we don't talk about as a specific threat per se is also the resource issue that you alluded to, which is the how do you scale the cybersecurity function, right? Because for every cybersecurity expert in the company, for every expert, there are at least 100 employees, if not more.
Right.
So we have to figure out how to anoint a lot of those employees to become quasi cybersecurity experts, mini CISOs, to basically help the organization better protect its resources. Because that is how IT is evolving. As IT gets more and more decentralized, employees are happy using productivity applications on the internet and so on and so forth. They also have to be educated and own up to protect whatever is it that they're using. That's the only way this scales, right? Because IT itself is decentralized. So the role of a CISO, for example, as even Gartner pointed out in one of their predictions last week, is going to go from a control owner to a risk decision facilitator. And so you're not just going to control and own everything anymore. That's in the rearview mirror. You have to figure out how to facilitate, how to get people to understand the risk, make the right risk trade offs, and provide them guidance, because the whole thing is decentralized.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And certainly our own research shows that there's a much stronger emphasis on some of the softer skills that the CISO is requiring, because it's all about influence, it's all about people, much more so than being able to fall back on that technology element, particularly in that decentralized environment that you've just been talking about. Ganesh, it's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you for taking the time to take us on that sort of whistle-stop tour from 1997 up to 2023, and indeed looking beyond. Some great points in there around AI, around people, and the future role of the CISO. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Steve. It was a great conversation. Thank you for all the great questions.
Our thanks to this week's guest, Ganesh Krishnan. And thanks to you for listening. We'll be back with a new episode next week. In the meantime, if you would take 10 seconds to pull up this podcast on whatever device you're listening, give us a 5-star rating and write a quick review, we'd be grateful. You can also listen to the ISF Analyst Insight podcast, which goes in depth on the hottest topics in information security. In every episode, ISF analysts hand-select active security professionals from ISF member organizations to discuss how the implementation of ISF research is uniquely applied to their real-world context. We hope you'll listen, and of course, we'll put a link to that show in our show notes. If there's a topic or question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode, let us know at securityforum.org, which is also where you can find our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert, with senior producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Thanks for listening.